So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First, a little disclaimer. I'm not associated with Postgraphile at all. It's just a library that we discovered a couple of months ago, and we find it very interesting. And when I mentioned that we was going to go giving this talk, the guys from Postgraphile was very friendly, and they sent us a bunch of material. There's some stickers and some sheets, so cheat sheets about GraphQL, about this library. So grab them, they are actually very interesting. So first of all, who among you would rather write SQL than JavaScript? Really? So many. Okay, that's cool, that's interesting. The second question is that who among you would rather use the right tool for the job than the tool that you're actually comfortable with? And this question is, you need to think about it a little bit, because what is the right tool? And this is something that you're going to be asking yourself throughout your career. It's questions that at the beginning of each project and even through the project, you're going to keep asking. And the only way to have a good answer about it is knowing which options you have and keeping up to date with those options. Now, every once in a while throughout your career, you're going to come through one option, a tool, a library, maybe some programming language, that is, that's going to change the way you work deeply. And this talk is about one of those options. So who am I? My name is Julio Garcia. I'm Chief Software Architect at Innovation Rocks, what he said. And I've been doing software development for a very long time. This is a photograph of my first computer with 4 kilobytes of RAM, mid-80s. You do the math. Yeah. And I'm going to be talking today about Postgraphile. Postgraphile is a library written in TypeScript that allows you to develop a database schema in Postgres. It uses reflection to get the structure of your database schema, and is able to generate automatically a GraphQL database. GraphQL backend endpoints. So I guess all of you have an idea about what GraphQL is. We don't need to get into that. Why is this important? For the last years or so, I have a little bit the feeling that we have started taking our databases for granted. Starting with the NoSQL movement and MongoDB, and relying even more with ORM systems and NoSQL databases. And even though there is a place for ORMs and there's a place for NoSQL databases, for a lot of projects, a traditional SQL database, especially something like Postgres, is very powerful. First of all, something like Postgres is they're incredible feats of engineering. Postgres is going to be 22 years old this year. They have been developing for more than 30 years, and throughout the time, they have been improving it constantly. Second point is that in a lot of occasions, especially when you have complex data structures and relationships between those data structures are very complicated, having the logic as close as possible to the data allows you to have some forms of optimization that are really not possible with ORMs. And at the end, the data is the foundation of your data, of your application. Of most applications, that's the basis on top of which everything is built, and foundations are important. We shouldn't take them for granted. So that means that in a lot of occasions, being close to the database and having the power of the database is actually the right tool for the job. And that's what Postgraphiles offers, that you can generate very quickly, very fast this GraphQL backend without losing any compromises, without making any compromises regarding the power of your Postgres database. So how do you do this? First, you start defining schemas. Schemas in Postgres are some kind of something like namespaces. This is the first architectural decisions that you want to make, and it allows you to make decisions, for example, in terms of security. One alternative, what I'm doing here, is a simple application, is a forum for questions and answers, and I'm dividing two schemas. One is going to be public and one is going to be private, which may come helpful if you're going to do like Facebook and store your passwords in plain text or things like that. You put them in at least in private, but I'm kidding, never do that. Anyway, so how does it work? First, you start the debate, you create your tables, like any other SQL instructions, how you create your tables. Then on the server, you can instantiate Postgraphile as a middleware for an Express application. You pass some configuration information there, the database that you're going to be hooking up. In this case, I'm setting up that I want the Postgraphile to watch my Postgres database, so every time I change the schema, it will reconfigure and recreate the backend again. And I set it up to my application. And we're finished. That's everything you need to do. So this allows you really to work very, very, very fast. But of course, you are not finished. It wouldn't be very useful if you weren't able to actually customize that your GraphQL queries, and also security. So the first alternative that you have for customizing the GraphQL is using something that's called smart comments. On top, you're going to see that there are regular comments. That's something that you can do in Postgres that allows you to keep the documentation. Where you go to the GraphQL on the right hand, when you see the documentation of your GraphQL, this text is you're going to be able to see that. But on the bottom, you see some other possibilities to customize. For example, in my table for developers, I don't want to expose the XP for the developer or the created at fields on the create or updates or on updates. This shouldn't be available when I do my GraphQL notations. Another possibility that I have is that using functions within Postgres, I can create computed columns. For example, in this case, I want to have a full name field in my GraphQL endpoint. And in order to do this, I just create a function with some certain parameters, with some certain following certain conventions, and I can get back my full name. One thing that you need to note here is that I'm not using SQL to write this function. I'm using JavaScript. That's one of the nice things that you can do in Postgres, is that you have the possibility to write your functions in a bunch of different languages. I once met a guy that was doing data analysis in R within Postgres. So if that tickles your fancy, that's something that you can do also. In any case, it is possible, it is there, and in some situations, it's gonna, we that were more familiar maybe with JavaScript, it's gonna help you develop some logic. Now, security. One of the things that you have to think about for implementing security is that we're gonna be using the security system from Postgres itself to secure your backend. That may sound like crazy talk, but it actually works. There's actually the guys from Postgres themselves, they have been spending a lot of time and a lot of effort, I've mentioned before, 30 years, making these things secure. So it's possible to create a very good and very granular security system. Another advantage that you have is that the closer that you have your security to the data, the less surface for attacks that you are opening some possible hackers. So in order to do the security for a Postgraphile system, first you go and lock everything up. For example, my functions, I don't want to make my functions available for public. Second, you define your roles. The roles that are going to be specific for your applications. These are roles within the database and should correspond to the roles of the types of users that you're going to have. The first one is the role that Postgraphile itself, the library, is going to use to connect to the database. And then I have two roles here defined, one for anonymous, for someone that is not registered, and one for our developers that have already registered. The next thing is that you go and you run permissions first to the schema, and you can see here I'm not giving permissions to any of these systems to the private schema that we mentioned before. And then depending on what you want to do, you give the permissions to different roles. For example, in the case of the questions, I want everybody should be able to view the questions table, but insert, update, and delete only has to be someone with the role of a developer. The next step is I'm created on this private schema a table to store my developer account with the fields that I don't want to risk making public. In this case, the developer ID, the email, and the password hash. Something that you can check here also is that it is possible to add some input validation direct on the database itself. The next step is that once you have defined this, the way Postgraphiles, you have different alternatives to handle the authentication. But one of the alternatives, the one that comes out of the box within Postgraphiles, is using JSON Web Tokens. The way that you create JSON Web Tokens is that first you define within Postgres a type that is going to have all the fields that you're going to have in your JSON Web Tokens. In this case, I have the role that I want the user to have. I have the ID of the developer and a standard field that is the expiration date of the token. I don't know if you guys have experience with JSON Web Tokens. At the end, I'm going to give some resources where you can learn more about them. And this is the function for authenticate a user. In this function, what I'm doing is you get the email and the password that the user trying to authenticate sends you. You get from the developer account all the row that corresponds to that email. You verify that the password hash corresponds to the password hash that is stored. And if that's the case, then you create here the content of your JSON Web Token, given the role that you're using, that is the developer ID, and I'm creating on the fly the expiration field, and returning as a JSON Web Token. So the next, doing that, we can guarantee that at this point that only developers can answer and can ask questions and update their own questions. But you don't want the developer to maybe update the question for someone else. So in order to solve this problem, you use something that is called RowLevel Security. It's a feature of Postgres starting on version 9.6, and it allows you to have very granular on a row level security for your different processes. For example, in this case, for the table of question, I'm letting everybody has to be able to select because everybody can read the questions. But if I want to insert a question, I'm going to verify that the author ID, that is the field that I have on the question, corresponds to the developer ID that I'm storing in my JSON Web Token. The way that is working is that Postgraphile in the background, once you log in and you are sending with the request the JSON Web Token, it inserts the fields of this JSON Web Token inside this session of the database, and you can access these settings with calling the current settings and use them to verify the security and the claims that the user is making. So once done that, you need to set a couple of settings on the side of the Node.js. I'm adding here what's the default role that the user is going to have, in this case the anonymous, and getting the secret. The secret is what is going to be used to sign the JSON Web Token, and also given the type that is used within Postgres to define the fields of the JSON Web Token. And we're finished. This way you have a secure GraphQL backend with login and authentication. This is an example of the authenticate mutation, given the email, the password, and I'm getting as a result the JSON Web Token. I've added extra the the developer ID just as convenience, even though it's encoded within the JSON Web Token itself. So there are still other options that you can have if you need to customize your backend further. For example, one thing that is very useful within Postgres is that you also have triggers, similar to the ones that we saw from Firebase. In this case, I want to, as I mentioned before, the XP of the user shouldn't be modified directly, but as a reaction of what he's doing. For example, I wanted to react whenever they answer a question. This XP needs to increase, but it's not a linear increase. It has to follow a certain function. So again, I'm going back to using the PL-v8, which is the JavaScript engine that runs within Postgres. And I'm creating this function, and below I define the trigger. And the trigger, what it's saying here is that before each insert on the table answer, I'm going to execute this procedure. And that way you can have a very clear separation of concerns. For example, you could define a function that modifies an updated at a field on the tables that is separated, that is isolated to the rest of the process, and is handled on its own. So these triggers are actually a very powerful feature. And if everything else fails, you still have the possibility to create your own plugins. Postgraphiles is built completely using plugins. And if you want, you go in and you can create new plugins, or you can replace plugins, or you can replace all the plugins that are within this GraphQL engine. Here is an example of a very useful Servus plugin. Everything is just, you get an input. I'm defining here my types from the GraphQL, and I'm creating my resolver. So this way you can work very fast. You saw it's a matter of hours. You can create a full GraphQL backend, and you are not losing any flexibility or any power regarding if you need some customization. And for me, and something that for us within the company, that was always very important, something that we have been delaying a little bit to go into the GraphQL, the whole GraphQL options, was that we were really looking for a solution that allows us to work with the database that we all love very much without losing any of the power. So this is how the GraphQL endpoint looks. I just set in a query with servos with the name, and I get the data back. This is a list of some resources. The documentation from Postgraphile is actually very good. This presentation is inspired greatly of one of the examples that I have inside. And here are a couple of resources regarding the JSON Web Tokens. It's an important topic, something that you can, I think is really very useful. And also some information about the running PL v8. I mean, to be honest, most of the time I'm using the regular language within Postgres, but on some occasion, as I said, and also because I can, it's nice to be able to run JavaScript in there. So, thank you very much.